Okay, so we are being recorded, and without any further ado, William, over to you.
Thanks very much. So our theme this morning, well, surpluses and change public policy have combined with a new technical actuarial standards to, we think, collapse the case for the 50 billion a year risk transfer market. And it opens up the possibility of far better pensions now and into the future. Well, why is that? Well, we think the maths behind the distinction between buyout and run-on dictates a governance review by trustees and sponsors, and with it, a policy reset, which will help everybody comply with the new DWP regulations. Consequences that we think the ultra cozy risk transfer world may need a bit of a prod, but members of schemes may only need to put one question. They're only one question away from much better pensions. So what is that question? Go on to the next slide. We'll see that the next question is, are you having practitioner advice on technical actuarial standard 300 version 2 section 5 yet? We haven't seen the question yet, but that is in principle what we're trying to get to. And why is that such a good question? Well, it's a good question really because it fits into an overall framework of change of public policy. And if you stand back just a little bit, you can see that the LDI debacle, really, that's been discussed many good times on the pension playpen, has had real consequence. The Bank of England and then the HM Treasury really got much more closely involved. And when they did, they asked for some input. And we gave them a little bit of input a year ago. We suggested in some consultations that with one sentence, the government could change pension funding strategies. We said they should encourage run-up. And so after the Mansion House and then the autumn statement, we were delighted to see that the Chancellor and the Secretary of State wrote to the CEOs of the TPR and the PRA, making the following statement, which you can see on the screen now. And if you actually, it's worth a bit of dwelling on this because it actually says encouraging alternatives to DB de-risking and buyout. Well, what does that mean? It means maybe buyout isn't the gold standard. Obviously, it's really aimed at schemes that are well-funded with strong employer covenants. Okay, that's a good point. Then making the assets work harder. Well, what does that mean? That means basically higher investment returns and enabling continued investment in a broad range of assets. Well, that means not just gilts and index linkers. And then going on beyond that to look at clearer funding standards in regulation, a code of practice and guidance. Well, what does that mean? It means TPR, get your act together. And it means then, and making it easier to share investment returns between sponsors and scheme members. Well, what does that mean? It basically means that there's some consultation, which is we've now seen coming in terms of making it easier to share surpluses. So we think at the end of that sentence, you can see an awful lot of the work that we've been doing way back to 2018. It's great to see it coming through in public policy. But not just there, it goes beyond onto the next little area that came up, which is really looking at what is now, we would say, a major important point, which is TAS300 version 2 being a trigger for change. Now, most people would probably, if we're asked a straw poll, maybe not of this audience, but of most audience, TAS300, not a clue. What are we talking about? But no, the technical actuarial standards are produced by the FRC, which works for the PRA, which works for the Treasury. This is the standards for the industry. And the new version, which was after a consultation last year, which we actually were pleased to make a bit of an input into, it says you must, this is not like if you happen to get around to it, you must do the following. You must look at options, alternatives, credible alternatives to buyout if you're thinking of doing a buyout. That is, again, quite clear cut, and you should look at potentially looking with additional funding and or security to enable you to run on. That is absolutely what we're delighted to say we've been working, particularly with our friends at VLK, on producing, which is ways in which you can run on sensibly in that kind of way. And of course, actually goes on, if you don't, as a practitioner, that's all the actuaries, know anything about it, you've got to go and do some research. It actually requires you to get sufficient relevant information. Even beyond that, on this fine document, it actually says it's not just about bulk transfers, it's any set of advice that's being given to trustees and to sponsors which could lead to a bulk transfer. So that brings buy-ins, longevity swaps, de-risking, dynamic de-risking all into the game. So quite an important piece of work. So not wholly surprisingly, it gets no time and attention, or certainly no public time and attention from the actuaries themselves. But the scope is wide, and it's great news for anybody who is in a pension scheme or a trustee of a scheme. It means the evidence demonstrating compliance must be available to the intended user if requested. So this is quite clear now. There is a new public policy in town. Obviously, since this came out and comes into practice April this year, since then, away you go. You've got to do this work on any bulk transfer. So anything that you see coming out as a bulk transfer now, you must assume this work's been done. We were rather hopeful that this would result in some big immediate changes. And you can see we actually think it, on analysis, collapses the case for buyouts. So we produced our little surplus collapse the case for buyouts, which I think it's safe to say hasn't had a major pickup, but from the industry. So that leads you round to a position where you've got run-on as being added into the mix by most of the consultants now as part of their washing line, something to consider before you dismiss it. But the numbers they're not doing, which is really the nub of really what we want to get to today, is what do you get when you do a buyout? What do you get that you haven't got today? So as a member of a scheme or a trustee is thinking about what do you get? Well, you get cover from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme rather than from the PPF. Okay, that's good. Yeah, excellent. Understand that. What's that worth then? Right. We don't actually do that sum for you. So it has been one for a long time, for a decade. I found this curious. But what is the benefit of the step up from one safety net to the other? What does the member of the pension scheme actually get in exchange for giving up potentially discretionary benefits, giving up discretionary benefits even before people retire? So all those opportunities are lost for the benefit of having this higher cover from the FSCS. So we thought, why don't we actually do some work in this area ourselves? So we have. We won't bore everyone with today. There are a number of key variables to look at: the inflation rate, when you actually accrued your pension, all this kind of thing. Go into it. If you are not yet retired or deferred, you currently have a bit of a haircut, 10% haircut on your benefits. So the industry has just assumed, well, that sounds like a lot, so it must be a lot. Therefore, if you manage to get to a buyout land, then you're better off. Okay, but when you start analysing that in a bit more detail, you find the numbers aren't so big. I've got a pension from Arga, for example, all post-97 service, and up to 2.5% inflation. There's no difference at all. Between 2.5 and 5, there is a difference. Above 5, there is no difference at all. So there's a case for saying, well, actually, the downside risk isn't that great. And then look at it on a probabilistic basis. What is the chance of your sponsor actually going bust? There is plenty of data to use here. Could give a whole new reason to do a covenant exercise, work out what is the real risk of you losing out on your pension. The answer is, by the time you've added in those numbers, and we can see a few of those coming up on the next slide, you really aren't losing out much at all. So well worth following up on. Very happy to talk about this in a bit more detail, but basically looked at on a probabilistic basis, and we've done all this good work now with our friends from Moody's, the downside risk to a member that is a member of a scheme with a decent sponsor is modest. Remember, if you're a triple B company, your chances of going bust in the next 5 years, is 1.5%. Chances of going bust in the next year are really 0.15%. These are very modest assumptions. If I put that on a probabilistic basis, and the downside isn't great. So we think, well, this is a whole area. It's a yawning gap in actuarial analysis that really needs attention from the industry before it says that, yes, you're better off giving your pension to a life insurer in that 50 billion a year industry. So that's what is worth making, spending a little time on and thinking about is, well, what is the upside? The answer could be answer to all the downside risk is there is some, maybe small, but what is the upside? And that's where surpluses really start to be very significant in the total equation. And how likely is it you're going to be able to use them? So if you look at the next slide, which has got we can look at a bit of an illustration of how surpluses can be used. So just pick up some baby numbers here. Let's say you've got a scheme with £1 billion worth of assets in it, and let's say the liabilities are also £1 billion, gilts 50, so on a self-sufficiency basis. So we have £1 billion scheme. How much do you think you're paying out a year in pensions? Well, there is a kind of, I think, rule of thumb relationship between your liabilities and what you're paying out at the moment for a reasonably mature scheme. Let's call it 50 million quid. So 20 times this year's payments will get you to your liabilities. Let's say it's 50 million quid going out a year. This is an active scheme, so still carry on paying DC contributions. Let's call those 20. Right. What I should be looking to achieve now if I run on is, let's call it 2% delta between the 0.5% of liabilities over gilts plus 50, and the total return I might look to achieve, taking in account two things: investment return and, let's say, another 0.5% for longevity assumptions, demography truing up. Our friends at ISIO have come up with somewhere between 2 and 2.5, but let's call it 2. Let's call it 2%. Okay, what's 2% of $1 billion? Oh, that's 20 million. All right, I've now got 20 million to think about. Where should I spend that? Now, this is back to the negotiating skills course for everybody, for the trustees as well, and who's going to get that? But if you think about it, 0.5% a year, or 1% if everybody's feeling generous to the members, that's an extra 10 to 20% a year to be paid on a discretionary basis, assume the scheme is in good nick. That's worth having. That is definitely worth including in your risk-benefit analysis of your pension scheme. So if you do that, and then you can look at, what about current employees, intergenerational unfairness? Look, what about we actually proffer some extra for DC members in a new DC tier? Very doable, all existing legislation. Or alternatively, we could say, well, actually, the company doesn't want to pay so much in. The company gets a direct benefit by its DC contributions being paid for by the DB surplus. So DB to DC, people think about that a bit. But the consequence is we've now got some serious money each year on a discretionary basis helping people's pensions. What could be anything other than seeing that as a good idea? As soon as you think about that as a trustee, I've now got some governance issues I need to think about. Am I doing as well as I could? Am I acting in the best interests of the members? And I think the case is that when you look at hard numbers as opposed to conceptual numbers, look at the numbers. Can you do better? Can we as an industry do better than we are at the moment? The answer is, I think, undoubtedly yes. So why isn't that happening at the moment? Well, there are a number of reasons why I think the risk-benefit analysis has been fairly flimsy over the years. And one of them is really the interpretation of whether the PPF exists or not. Now, the industry came up, or the PPF and the TPR came with a blinder, really, in convincing many, many people that the PPF doesn't exist at all and can't be taken into account in any way. And that has always seemed like strange. And indeed, when you look at the basis for that, well, there isn't one. The basis is a couple of court cases that go back long, long, long into the past now, 2009, where there was a case of open independent trustees. The most relevant point of that is the judge is not making, and says explicitly, they're not making a general statement on when the PPF can be deemed to exist. It was a case, and I've actually spoken recently to a nice person who was actually the lawyer to the PPF when the case went through, and they acknowledged it was very much designed to create folklore, not to create law. And the consequence has been brilliant, that the industry has behaved like a bunch of loss adjusters for the PPF, but hasn't really done the work when it comes to actually looking at what's relevant to members. And relevant is an important word here because from a trustee's point of view, you have to answer relevant, you have to ask relevant questions. You have to take into account relevant information about the scheme. And what could be more relevant to a risk benefit analysis than what the risk actually is numerically? So I think that alone, the interpretation of the PPF needs a little modification. And when you do it, you're going to result in some new strategies, I think. And if we look now what that could mean for everybody, first maybe looking at the governance from what the trustees might do, what the trustees might consider doing next. Well, I think you've got to complete the exercise, do the work, make sure that the actuaries have looked at TAS300 V2 as a relevant question, and then think what are the other options you do have on the table. And we think that the de-risk and risk transfer life insurer really not only costs the members a lot of view, but costs the scheme a lot of money. Actually, it's very interesting when you get even people who've worked closely at the TPR recognize it's a problem in that you're having everyday pension schemes de-risking down to a very low level of return to enable them to be transferred to a life insurer who then immediately re-risks them pretty much to a kind of portfolio that they started with. So there's a middle person here that is making an awful lot of money, maybe unnecessarily. So you should look at other things and what we christen run on for good, obviously stock market reference with the for good, because we think a long-term asset strategy run on, let's say for 10 years, consider some guarantees if you need it, but then think about this surplus allocation to improve the position for everybody, all things that the trustees should be looking at. And if governance needs reviewing, what a great time to be doing it. So we think these, what we might christen TAS300 inspired reviews, just open up a whole raft of really positive, interesting areas. And the trustees should, as a punchline, be looking to create what you might call a framework agreement to put to the sponsor, because you have discretion available to you. It's one of the rules. We know most corporates are wildly enthusiastic about exercising discretion, but you need to ask questions to which the answer can be yes, not no. So a framework agreement, I think, from the trustees' angle is well worth having. And if you look at it from the sponsor's point of view too, there's no point in just saying, I hate pensions. I wish that we hadn't got one. get rid of it as soon as possible. Because actually, when you stand back and think of your pension scheme more as in a positive way, as TC would call it, as a corporate wealth fund, you actually do get a different perspective, because this scheme can make you money. It can align and become a worked example of your ESG practices, and I think it will be seen by your employees as something where you are really thinking about them. So all the things that do get into corporates mindset, into boardroom thinking, are there for you to play with. So you then look at, yes, there's a lot of work to be done. Won't delay us too much to think about that, but we've done an awful lot of analytics here, all of which point in the same direction, that there's good stuff to be done. When you look at it from a trustee point of view, a sponsor point of view, or going on to the wider market point of view, not just around people who are directly involved, but what about the market overall? I think Run On for Good can help the stock market. We've had years and years and years in which people have downplayed, been de-investing in the stock market. Well, perhaps that can come to an end. Perhaps people can stop selling illiquid assets because they think that they are standing in the way of a buyout. All that can be looked at again. We think the stockbrokers, the IFAs, the shareholders generally should all see that the pension scheme, the game's changed. The government wants it to change. You can just prod people in the right direction and you'll have a far bigger impact than you ever expected. So where does that leave us? We're going to what conclusions can we reach from all this? I think the conclusions that I see as coming through, once you've been through all our good homework, you would conclude a few things. Well, TAS300 Section 5 is important. It's ignored, but it is important. The TAS in 2017 was ignored. It will be ignored unless people point to it as actually being a centre of attention for public policy. We think that the risk-benefit analyses, which are implicit in looking at bulk transfers against Run On, highlight there are major gaps in actuarial work. How can an industry that is actually transferring £50 billion of pension liability from one regime to another not actually do some basic work that works out what is the risk and what upside is being ignored? Remember, the life insurers are doing extremely nicely. So it does suggest there is value at stake to be considered. We think the case for the buyout is really collapsed by the homework that needs to be done. And I think the members should be asking that question of their trustees and the sponsor. What are you doing in this area? Because you want to see that discretionary power that the trustees have used for best effect, used to help real people every day. Why is it that that money isn't now being applied? Because it could be. With the regime, the flexibility in the regime as it exists is plenty sufficient to enable discretionary increases to be paid out now. So I think industry, it's incumbent on the industry to have a really good look at it. And if it does, the benefits are tremendous, I think, for the industry. If asset managers can provide products attuned to a 10-year program, then obviously that's good news for them. And you can look to insurers to take out any residual risks that may still be within the scheme, but there'll be renewed confidence flowing back into London capital markets. The effort that many people are putting into that at the moment is terrific. But here is a great example of where a little bit of regulatory change can make a hell of a difference. So we commend to you, really, TAS300 version 2. I think it is a game changer for the industry. It can bring to an end, what has probably been the most costly single word for people's pensions in the UK, which is endgame. This can be an endgame for the endgame. So that's really where I got to in our thinking. And if you go on, I think it's well worth dwelling on. There's a couple of, we always like to distill some of our arguments maybe into a pictorial way rather than just looking at it as the one question that you should ask. Perhaps when you do look at it, you should recognize that actually there is that one good question to ask, and you can be quite punchy in asking it. And here's a good couple of manifestations of that. A couple of people are clearly in one of the pension schemes decide that they really do need to look at it. So I'll leave you with those, and maybe TAS300 impacts everybody, looking at different manifestations. You can see here a little montage of who's a winner. Well, maybe better pensions, sunny uplands for the membership. The trustees, maybe it's time to get a little bit more stuck into a few of these discussions, not leave it to the consultants and to the life insurers. Maybe the life insurers have had it too good for too long. But here you can see perhaps the corporates. You need to get a little bit more stuck in. There's a lot of money at stake, a lot of positives for everybody if you do. So we think that aftermath of the LDI crisis has actually given rise to some really interesting, and I think ultimately will prove to be a very positive change in the pension sector, which will serve to provide better pensions for an awful lot of people. So that was my pitch for change in the pension sector by maybe doing a little bit more maths.
Thank you, William. That's great. Already we have a hand raised from Rosalind. Would you like to unmute, Rosalind, and ask your question or make your point?
Yes, of course. I mean, obviously, I'd ask a question. I never don't, right? I mean, I thought that was really interesting, and I think there are a lot of really interesting points in there. There is one thing that I perceive as causing a problem for employers being bought into this, and obviously, the point is with these is very often, in my experience, buyout is driven by an employer. It's driven by an employer who wants to get it off its books and away. It is a mixture of the current legislation and a lottery of how pension scheme rules were written years ago when the law was all very different, means that very, very, very few schemes have the power to use their DB surplus for DC benefits, even if they'd had a DC section for years. And for a very large number of schemes, getting any money back from a surplus is really limited. Now, it seems to me there is an argument that says, well, that's great because that will encourage them instead to put more people into a DB scheme. But I don't know if we ever think that's going to happen. It'd be nice, but I'm not sure. Do you think there is a case here for, and I know there's been some consultation on it, but I didn't think the consultation was terribly good, really. There is a case for government stepping in and saying, okay, we need to retip the balance of power to some extent. We did for lots of good reasons. We protected members, but we've now got to a place where if you're an employer, there's no upside and you just want the thing to just go away. Is there a value, do you think, in maybe some legislation to allow people to use the surplus to pay for DC contributions or do the kind of things that's a plus point for employers?
Yeah, no, really good. I think it's absolutely at the heart of the matter here. I think corporates need to get stuck in. They need to put more focus on this. And most boards of corporates, I was on corporate boards for 25 years, have parked pensions. I wish it would go away. It's all the things you just set out. Get rid of it ASAP. Get rid ASAP is a very good theme summary. But actually, when the numbers are put in a different kind of way, as we were trying to do, there needs to be a clear, available financial upside to the sponsor, just as there should be an upside to the membership. And this is really, we think, these little exercises we're advocating with TAS300 lend themselves to a new consensus. Clearly, most trustees have a discretionary power, but there's with consent from the sponsor. And you need to start asking better questions. If you ask a question, can I have some more? The answer is obviously no. If you ask a question of, if this was the package, would you say yes? I don't think it's too difficult to produce that. And one of the reasons I think that is that corporates have largely given the thing over to finance folk rather than HR. And I was CEO for many years of groups, and people on the whole are perfectly reasonable. If they can see that there is a reason to get involved here, they will. There's one is financial. The other is if you're the chairman or the chief exec or chairperson of a corporate, you have made a lot of statements in the last few years around your ESG strategies and your view of people. And here is a great opportunity to show a worked example. In fact, if you don't take it, there's serious questions, why not? And, we think that pensions should be part of an ESG ratings exercise that anybody would do. It would make a big difference, both to a corporate and to, as we well know, most, and indeed LCP admitted, that most trustees are going through the motions when it comes to ESG. So here's a reason why that, rather than becoming a problem, can be overcome. We think that there is a heart of the issue here is corporates' lack of engagement. Can you address it? Yes, because when the numbers on this kind of revised basis are put to companies and they can see the upside, their attitudes will change. Their attitude will change. It will be a positive thing. If you look at the kind of statements we saw from the Chancellor and the follow-up from Mel Stride and all this sort of stuff, yeah, attitudes have changed. And there is now a growth agenda. We spoke, actually with Con was on the call too, we spoke with folk from the Labour Party. There isn't going to be any radical shift if there is a Labour government. They will do more of the same. In fact, we talked about encourage. We were saying, do you upgrade encourage to expect? But you could argue that there's already a must anyway. So we just think that this is such an obvious source of finance to help boost the economy by using it in a more positive kind of way. People will just get the gist. It may take a while for the penny to drop, but I think it will.
And you think that that still is going to encourage people, despite the fact that the existence of their defined benefit pension scheme can send them to prison for 7 years? Because to me, that's a problem. We have had years and years and years of legislation, including by the same people who are saying, oh, you pension schemes should invest in the latest thing I want you all to invest in, because this isn't new. Over the last 10 years, been lots of different things we all had to invest in. But at the same time, you threaten people. And I think, in my experience, speaking to, I haven't been a CEO of a large listed company, but I've advised a lot of them. They all want to get out. They're desperate to get out. And they're desperate to get out because there is endless and ongoing legislation against them. And actually, I think there needs to be a grown-up conversation that says maybe our over-legislating every time something hits the press that we don't like is a bad idea. And you're not going to change minds until you do that.
That's absolutely correct. I think that's why I'm making a quip about you need to look at your PI policy as well. I think people do need to put this in a bit of perspective. What's the really, when you actually look at the risks that folk are taking, and you need, and this is why I was saying you do need to respond to things like government policy. You do need to do the exercises properly. But if you do and you behave reasonably, in theory, anybody, there's risk in any position. I know I was director for so many years and include chair of the trustees at various points. There are risks, but as the city minister said, Bim is a very I think able guy. They were saying, there's a level of hostility to any kind of risk. And it seems to me that trustees, if you can't see that there's a better way forward for everybody, perhaps at least you should tell the membership that that's your opinion, that you're not really trying to get them any better pensions because X, Y, and Z reason, but the only way out is to give it to a life insurer. I think if you start standing back, you're going to see that actually that creates the trustee new risks because you haven't done your job.
So your job isn't to give people a better pension; it's to give people the pension that they have secured. I do think there is a bit of a challenge here. And that people tend to think that a trustee's duty is to give members the best pension they can. And I'm talking in terms of your personal risk of being sued, since you brought risk up. You know, your risk is that you are sued because you have made a decision which has resulted in members not getting the benefits actually promised by the scheme, not the better ones augmentations you might be able to get them, not new pensions for new people. So I think from a trustee point of view, again, I think policymakers really misunderstand what trustees' duties are, which is why a lot of the stuff they say is unworkable. Now, or they can change the law about what trustees' duties are. I mean, if you're in government, that's a thing you can do that none of us can do. But until that time, it is not the duty of trustees to improve members' benefits. It's the duty of trustees to pay the benefits.
Yeah, that's a fantastic, interesting, because I don't think that is the correct interpretation. It is most people's interpretation. I'm not sure it's the correct interpretation.
Well, in the years you've been running businesses, I've been advising on pensions law. I'm pretty confident on that. To be honest,
it's a really, really interesting moot point, I think. Yeah.
Okay, William. Peter, Cameron, Brown, you've had your hand up, and then we'll come to Bryn as well. So, Peter, you go first, and then we'll come to Bryn if we may.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, William, for an excellent presentation. Starting off just with a little bit of background and history. We're running an open DB scheme, which has moved from deficit to a very large surplus over the last 10 years. And so we are reported in the company's balance sheet as an asset. And because the scheme is still open, the asset ceiling tests are still appropriate to report that asset. And even if the asset ceiling had been applied, we are in danger, or the company is in danger of reporting the pension scheme cost under FRS 102, which is its reporting standard, as being a negative figure, i.e. they've got a profit from running a DB pension scheme in the accounts. This is creating a little bit of issue to do with what should be the goals and companies' attitude to discretionary enhancements to benefits, which, to pick up on Rosalind's point, I would suggest that if there's discretionary benefits in the deed, then the trustee's duty is to try and pay those benefits up to any discretionary limit that's in the deed. And that is often overlooked when you're doing risk transfer. The thing I wanted to pick up on is the possibility of reopening to DB accrual rather than DC accrual. Now, when I'm dealing with some of the finance directors I deal with, I'm looking at the situation. If they've got a surplus, if they apply it to DC benefits, effectively the surplus is going to those members' own personal accounts. If you're using that surplus to fund future DB benefits, it is going into the pool of assets to be used across all the members and can be invested on that basis, so that will build it forward. Also, if the scheme is in deficit, and some of them have found this out, they have taken an LDI position, which means they have swapped their high income earning assets for low income earning assets, but they're paying out pensions. And if those pensions are substantially larger than the contributions the company can afford to pay in on a cash flow basis, it is having to sell, this pension scheme is having to sell its capital assets to pay those pensions in the immediate few years. And which assets do they sell? Do they sell the high income earning assets or the low income earning assets?
I think the thing is to see the pension scheme, say more positively, that it's well established technology. You can open a new, let's say, a DC tier within a DB scheme. That's been available to people who wanted to do. So you can have a new tier which can have restrictions on how the money is used, or so it is available to people if you want to do it. I think is the point. Is the last 20 years, 25 years, most people have just been get me out of here, so they haven't been terribly interested in that. How can you make it work practically, but that protects the past, but looks to the future? And I can't. The big schemes, it screams at you, and I know Con will probably agree here. It screams at you that the surpluses should be going into new CDC tiers. For the big schemes, or or you can use master trust. There's a whole underdeveloped technology here, which as soon as you conclude that I'm not trying to get out of here as soon as possible, I'm happy to run it on, come on the agenda. And I think it's really exciting. It should be an exciting time for the actuarial world. They've had it so good for so long, doing such simple things as just getting the paperwork straight. And giving it to a life insurer at the first opportunity. No, there's a lot of really interesting hinterland of HR issues that can come up, investment issues, much more interesting subjects. But if you don't want to do the investment side, well, I think that's a problem. That's why we're very keen on fiduciary. You're not asking people to suddenly think, corporates to suddenly think they're getting restuck into pensions. No, just modernize your thinking. There's so many lots of available opportunities, lots of available technology. So it doesn't mean you haven't got to sit down and do some thinking. But that's why we think what a great opportunity TAS300 provides everybody. Let's get back to where things would have been a generation ago. And let's sit down and work out what works for everybody. That should be the role, I think, of the actuary, can actually understand everybody's position. They're not in a pendulum negotiating thing. They're actually working out what works for everybody, because the great thing, let's go back to my ARGA experience as well, which was interesting. We worked out a solution which worked for everybody, recognizing all participants could veto any proposal. The consequence was that we produced something which back in 2016 basically meant the scheme didn't de-risk anymore, but the amount of contributions was pretty much fixed. And of course, now that scheme looks in terrific nick, really, because the excessive de-risking and the high contributions made the scheme so unpopular just didn't happen. Everybody's got their own little stories and very important stories about what's happened. But I think just what a great chance now with the new public policy in place, which I think the Treasury and team deserve a lot of credit, but hopefully the incoming, if there's a new regime coming in, they do the same. Great time. It just needs some of the big consultants to stop thinking about this year's budget and actually think about what is the way that they can really help people.
Okay, William, that's a good, good answer, I guess.
Can I just add
Bryn?
a quick
Oh, sorry, go on,
postscript?
Peter. Yeah, we'll come to Bryn then. Yep, go on.
Just one of the things that the companies have lived with pension scheme deficits on their balance sheets now for 20 years and they're still around. The pension scheme deficit is in fact a contingent liability, not a real liability, and that's often misunderstood.
I think you can overstate the fear. I was a finance director when a lot of stuff came on balance sheets. It's not that scary. It's not that scary. Particularly now you've actually got an investment strategy which looks pretty similar to AA corporate bond. So it's volatile, but it's not out of control volatility. This is stuff, other areas of business, much more difficult.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Bryn, you'd like to ask a question or make a point?
Yeah, well, both really. Thank you very much for this. All great stuff, and I've had a look at your website, and there's lots of really useful material there. I was advising trade unions back in the previous time when most schemes are in surplus, and the big shift in the approach didn't actually come with tougher financial times. It came with the switch. First you met the human resources director, or whatever they were called at the time, and then it became the finance director. And the finance director, driven, I assume, in large part by the accounting standards, but by also they talked to each other and they picked up ideas. So the finance directors became the key here. So my question is, what in all you say is going to appeal to the finance director, who will still have in their mind, let's just get rid of this, I don't need it. Just to add, there is some sort of discussion, what's going to happen to it, about legislative change to facilitate overriding legislation that would facilitate the use of surpluses. There's a big question. I don't know whether Con wants to come in as to whether all those surpluses are really there, but let's assume they're there. And I'm sure the legislation will say something about consultation. But in this area, consultation really doesn't add up to much. In my experience, only proper discussion was when there was negotiation between a recognised trade union and the employer. And the experience at that time is that people reached deals. There were deals to be made, and people made them between the trade unions and the employers. So I think the precedent here is pretty good, but it's not about consultation. It's about negotiation, which lies outside. I think good deals for the members will probably only be arrived at where there's proper negotiation. And just finally, on the PPF, we must always remember the PPF, I think it's very important, should be taken into account, but there's gaps in PPF coverage, principally the pre-97 benefits, both rights, and also there were plenty of schemes pre-97 that gave members reasonable expectation of increases, even when it wasn't there in the rules. They wrote to members and they said things like, we will fund the scheme hoping to provide you with increases. And so I think the trustees have to look at, I know the pre-97 people are sort of dying out and leaving, but the trustees do need to think about gaps in what the PPF coverage provided, and how by running the scheme on, you're actually providing all members with the same level of protection, whereas the PPF doesn't.
No, I think there's obviously really punchy point, important point. I think giving almost like thinking through each of the people who are relevant to the corporate. For the finance director, what really matters is clearly can you show something that's going to cost them less and make look better. And I think so less cash, more profit is going to go down pretty well. As I think the balance sheet volatility is pretty much dealt with net asset terms. But I think less cash, I think, is extremely appealing. There's some accounting which we can needs to be worked through, which we've done. But I think you can do something from a finance director which starts to look very attractive, particularly if stockbrokers, shareholders are lighted on this as a point that they wanted to raise. At the moment, it's not just the finance directors respond to shareholders. If the shareholders don't ever ask a question and just tell them to get off pensions as a subject as quickly as possible, as many of our shareholders used to do, then there is no need to get engaged. If you start getting engaged because you think a lot of people that matter to you are going to ask questions other than haven't you got rid of it yet, I think that makes a very immediate difference. And the other thing which appeals to finance directors is reputational risk. And if they think that they could get caught out greenwashing, or the chair could, or the chief or the CEO is going to get flack because their pension scheme doesn't invest in a way which is in line to their ESG strategy, which it's not the finance team that are really on the hook for that. I think that starts to make a big difference. But the extra feature, which also makes a difference to finance directors, is if the HR people, exactly as you got stuck in and said, tell you what, if you do this, then we'll be able to give better pensions to our DC people. And if we do that, then we have a competitive advantage. That is good news. We will be the people that will be much more connected to a new, younger workforce that are interested in in better pay and conditions. Yeah, this needs to be seen holistically as an opportunity for the board. And I think your other, I think, very important point really about the pre-97s. You know, this has got to be a coming subject. You know, we've actually, in some of the modelling I've been doing, and Charlotte has done some fantastic stuff on this for C-suite, looking back at the pre-97. How much do you lose? Are you losing? It is vital, really. Two things, I think. One, that the scheme doesn't keel over. Okay, but because if you fall into the PPF, that is obviously bad news. How likely? One question. But if you are going to have surpluses that you're going to allocate, one of the things that should happen, I think, is look at those pre-97 increases. And one thing that you might be very interested in, I think there's a consultation, and I agree, consultations may not go anywhere. But one of the things the consultation on the PPF should be is there is no excuse, I think, with a 12 billion surplus not to be looking at those increases for pre-97 people. And I think if the PPF started doing it, it would, for those schemes that haven't got any pre-97 increases, like Hewlett Packard came up in the debate in the Commons. Yeah, perhaps that's the moment at which those sorts of corporates could start looking at it as well. So I think it's the pre-97 should be a live part of this subject.
Okay, William, thank you. Shay, we'll come to you, and then we'll go to JQ. Shay, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thanks very much, Steve. And thank you, William, for an excellent presentation. So I'm a forensic risk actuary and a researcher. I was commissioned by the UK government some time ago to do the forensic and very discreet confidential review of the pensions regulator following the BHS scandal. So I just have two comments. In my research, I found a significant distinction in cases between policy, the interpretation and the implementation of that policy, including by TPR itself. So although I fully support defined benefit schemes and the preservation of such schemes, I'd just like to pick up on a point that Rosalind raised with respect to elements of the framework which need to be changed. And I do believe there are elements of the legal framework which need work. And I'm just wondering whether it would be worth the government and policy writers engaging with advisors such as Rosalind to pick up on these points which she raised, where there are discrepancies which are causing people to be scared of going to jail, etc., in order to design a new framework. So thank you, Steve. That's all I wanted to say.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think there's, I make the quip about law and folklore, and I think there's things that has suited the industry to pick up on, and I think they use that sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt to intimidate people into making poor decisions, and I just don't see, if you're getting decent, proper legal advice that says, oh, you're not responsible for this. Yeah, I think that takes such a narrow interpretation that I don't think it stands up to much analysis. And I also think there's been deliberate attempt not to get clarity in certain areas, because I'm sure if you've done the research, it's remarkable how thin the legal opinion or the amount of work that's been done to clarify what should be some pretty straightforward questions around what is your responsibilities and it seems to me, if trustees are taking a particularly narrow view, I think one of the things maybe coming out, even the DWP or the Work and Pension Select Committee suggestion that you should have to go back to members being clearer on what your strategy is. I think that trustees should spell out to their membership what they're trying to do. If you're a trustee for a scheme and you're not even trying to, you're seeing your responsibility as purely to get rid ASAP, I think you need to tell people. Otherwise, what's the point in there being the consultation about use of surpluses and all this stuff? If you're just saying I'm not interested, that's just, to me, just not good enough.
Okay, William, thank you. JQ, you've been very patient. Do you want to unmute?
Thank you very much. Yes, great shining a light on a lot of these things, William. So, as you know, we we're coming to the market with a best of both worlds solution, which is the full buyout with the discretionary increase capability out of fund insurer, stroke, excess capital going back to sponsored. Where do you think that sits in the pantheon of solutions that you put on the table there?
I would say it's just a good idea. I think it's reflective of the idea that there's better things to do than just give it to life insurer on the money. How much risk or residual risk the trustees want to take, how much residual risk the corporate wants to take, very, if any, how much that upside they want for particular groups, all very sensible things to discuss. What's the best way through? And obviously, you know, we've got our solution with running on and fiduciary plus and all this kind of stuff, which is I think a terrific approach. If there are nuances, distinctions, that's good too. What we're really saying is people should stop being intimidated and thinking that the life insurer is the only home for this sort of issue, risk. There are balances to be struck, and I think, a renegotiation, as I say, there's new negotiation, new tones for negotiation that can come into play, and I think, there's good options available. I think one of the things I'd like to think of this kind of conversation doesn't mean the life insurers haven't got an important role to play, but not such an easy approach that you're the only show in town, we're the gold standard, all this kind of stuff. No, show us the numbers, show us why it works for everybody. Fine, but just this sort of lazy presumption, that is one thing that certainly should go.
Okay with that, JQ?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Okay. Chris Bumford, do you want to go next, and then we'll come on to Susan?
Cool. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, William. Yeah, great presentation. Yeah, definitely believe we should be looking at more innovative ways of using the money in the pension schemes. But like others have said, employers finding it a bit harder to convince of that prospect. I had one point to note, just that I don't think I'm sure the PPF benefits aren't guaranteed. So when we're comparing with the PPF, if a big scheme with a big deficit were to go in, there is a chance PPF benefits could be reduced and aren't a sort of guarantee there for scheme members. But my main question was just on the on your analysis. I work with a lot of smaller schemes where the expenses are a large portion of their sort of the fund every year. Is there a size above which your analysis have shown that there's kind of profit to be made, or below which it's not really viable going forward?
Really, both points are in, exactly. The PPF and what it covers is really important point. Just like the FSCS, you know, it's unfunded and untested. So under extreme pressure, all sorts of things could happen. But I don't think any of the safety nets are. I think the reality is they're all pretty good in terms of scale. I started off thinking, gosh, this is only, you know, the analysis. This is maybe only for the larger. Actually, as you go down through the scales, I'm increasingly unconvinced that this only applies to the big boys and girls. I think one of the costs, and there's a piece at the moment out from our friends at Hyman, which is a total yes minister job. You know, sort of, you know, well, you could think about running on, but it's so many difficult questions. Of which scale, they quote some numbers from 2014 on how costly it is. I think the industry should work harder on getting the cost base down in certain areas. Admin can improve, admin costs could come down. So I was actually talking to one of the major platform producers last week, and I don't see how it can be that a £100 million scheme, you know, or even smaller, a £75 million scheme, can't be run in such a way that there is a sensible, this 2% delta we've been talking about, that covers the cost. Perhaps one of the things that the corporate should maybe say, the first thing that should be covered is the scheme pays all its costs. it pays all its own cost. You've got a major new downward pressure on cost, because the next one could be the money, extra money for members. So I think the industry, before it just concludes this is only for the larger people and says, can we get on doing buyouts for all the smaller one? Yeah, I'm sure you could produce a case for the very small, but I can't see there isn't a case to answer a £50 million scheme why you should look at it and say, actually, why, if I'm producing an extra 2% of a billion, that's a million, where's all that money gone then? So, or does it need to go that way? Do I need to simplify the governance? Do I need to have fewer trustees, or do I have, if I have the whole thing, the asset management on a fiduciary basis? All these things are perfectly sensible things. So I think it's you shouldn't start from a position of this is not for me until I think run some of the numbers a little bit harder and looked at the risk benefit analysis for schemes, and it may well be that people say, oh, it's just not worth it, and there's life insurance an important market, it always have been, but I think there's a lot more schemes than you think one might think at first flush to whom a rethink is applicable.
Cool.
Okay, William.
Thanks, Neil.
Cool. Thank you. Brilliant. Susan, you had your hand raised for a long, long time, so apologies, but probably the last question, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And it's actually just a short comment rather than a question. I'm actually a scheme actuary and consultant, so I thought it would be good to offer my perspective. And I'm from Hymans Robertson, so you teed me up nicely there. Yeah. Yeah. So I think just to add my perspective, and I know perspective shared by many colleagues and actuaries, is one of shared views of many of those expressed on the call today. So notwithstanding the challenges, I think there is appetite. I think there's appetite from trustees. I think there's appetite from consultants. And I speak from the perspective of a scheme actuary who's been practicing for nearly 30 years. So I too remember the surpluses of old, and it feels different this time. It feels like there's much more appetite, shared appetite to find a way through the challenges. So yeah, do push your consultants and actuaries, because I think you're pushing against an open door. So yeah, it was just to end on a positive note, really.
No, I'd say I think there's a lot of fantastic folk in the actuarial firm doing this. I think what's really happened is that the risk transfer industry arms have just got too powerful, and it's made too much money within the firms. And if you had a bit of a rebalancing, I certainly agree with you. Lots of folk you talk to, but that's not where the money's made, and therefore that is a problem. I think with this sort of the terrific work so many people are doing, it's just get back to a consensus, that the objective is to produce a consensus, not a profit alone for the consultancy. But that's, so I agree. I think it is, and that's why I go back to me. I think there is, and it's for the last few years, just wrapping out in terms of talking to lots of different people, and TC does it a lot with his headhunter chat. I think there is a genuine, I agree, there is a consensus that what's happening at the moment isn't the best thing that could happen, and something needs to change. And when it does, I think it will come, and I think it's already starting since the statement from the Chancellor and from the Secretary of State. I think it is changing, and I think we're getting a really exciting time for pensions, because there's a new mindset that is quite pervasive.
Okay, William, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I think that we've probably come to the end. William, fantastic presentation. So hopefully lots of claps, or digital claps, or wavy hands, or whatever to you. That'd be great. Oh, Chris, you got your hand raised. Is that a well done? Oh, that's a well done. There we go. But William, thank you very, very much indeed. Thanks to you and Charlotte, especially, and TC for joining from C-Suite. Really interesting. The video of today will be up this afternoon on our media tab on pensionplaypen.com. And yeah, that was excellent, William. Thank you very much indeed. If anybody would like the slides, then please contact me or Henry Tapper, and we will get those slides to you. Thank you, Chris. And yeah, really appreciate your input. That was really good. And yeah, as a network of connected pensions people, we should be challenging the industry and we should be challenging ourselves. So it was a great presentation. So thank you very much. And I thought Susan's comments at the end were a big rah-rah for the consultants as well. So well done, Susan. So that's good. Next week we've got In Conversation With. Henry's teeing up someone In Conversation With, so look out for the invitations for that. As I say, the video for today will be up on the Pension Playpen site. And as usual, we also pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East. And we hope we can make the world a better place, as they say. So, and as the song goes. So enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully we'll see you at the next Playpen event. And there's also a save the date coming out to everybody, which I think is summer drinks on the 18th of July. So everybody will be getting an invite to summer drinks on the 18th of July in Paternoster Square somewhere in the city. So that'll be a Pension Playpen invite as well. And I think also in partnership with Barker Tatham and a few others. So yeah, if you can make the 18th of July, it would be nice to see you all face to face. We live in a digital world now, but it'd be nice to see you and face to face. So thanks for your time today. Thanks for your input. Thanks for listening, and hope you enjoyed the presentation, and have a safe rest of the week. Thanks a lot. All right, take care. Cheers. Bye. Cheers, William. Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.